Three Lakes. We're so happy you're here, and we're anxious to share what happened to our little town 100 years ago. The Three Lakes Historical Society and the Demo Library collaborate on an immersion excursion or an out-of-museum experience. So I'm Kyle, I'm from the Three Lakes Museum, and with April Hansen of the Denver Library, we've created this series, Immersion Excursions, where we take you to where the history has happened. Today's immersion, with the help of Channel 12 Chief Meteorologist Geoff Weller, will show you both the historic and scientific elements of the tornado that raced through Three Lakes, right down Superior Street, the street that's right outside the front doors here, 100 years ago to the day, at 4 o'clock, just after 4 o'clock this afternoon, except at the time the theater didn't exist yet. This theater, the Three Lakes Center for the Arts, is an exceptional facility originally built by Cy Williams and brought back to its intended purpose by a group of dedicated people with great foresight, and we're thankful to be provided the opportunity to be here and share Three Lakes history with you all. The tornado truly tested the resilience of our small community, but because the residents put adversity behind them and moved on, we're able to both commemorate and celebrate once again in Three Lakes today. On Sunday, September 21st, 1924, beginning at about 2:30 p.m., several violent storms moved from southeastern Minnesota through northern Wisconsin, causing death and destruction across wide swaths of the area. The National Weather Service and State of Wisconsin records refer to that day as one among the most deadly storm days of the 20th century in this state. There were at least 6 separate tornadoes reported across northern Wisconsin on that single day. Record keeping and damage assessment methods were inconsistent in the 1920s, but in a little over 3 hours, 30 people were believed to have lost their lives and 115 people were injured, most in Thorpe County. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the news about tornadoes and cyclones was everywhere, except in the weather forecast. Until 1950, American weathermen were forbidden to use the word tornado in a weather report. Back then, when science was still struggling to find a scientific explanation behind the storms, tornadoes were considered a dark, mysterious force, and mentioning them was believed to cause fear and panic. There was no warning of impending danger. And so it was that afternoon in Three Lakes. It had been hot and humid on Saturday, with the same weather continuing into Sunday. Rain and thunderstorms moved over the town throughout the day, and just prior to 4 o'clock, it became obvious that the storm was intensifying rapidly. Fortunately, because it was Sunday, there were few people around, and the storm moved over the area to the northeast, flattening large areas of uninhabited forest, keeping injuries low and a fatality to 1. There are many stories and anecdotes from those harrowing minutes, as newspapers across the state reported. People and communities gathered resources and money to help. The people of Three Lakes immediately began to pick up the pieces and put their community back together. Historians like myself like primary sources, and I'm going to take you through town as observed by a mother in a letter to her daughter, written the following day. When the storm passed over, this family was at their Laurel Lake home. When they entered Three Lakes the next day, they were coming from the east, out that way past Shell Station, and heading west. As I read the letter to you, you will see pictures that correspond to what she has witnessed, and I'll point out some landmarks. So I'll be reading from a letter from Mrs. J.B. Berry to her daughter, Mrs. George Summer. Monday, September 22nd, 1924, 2 p.m. Now, I'll be reading this, and if this was a Ken Burns documentary, I'd have somebody else's voice reading the part of the letter reader. But since it's just me, you'll have to kind of figure out when I'm reading her letter and what we're talking about in the pictures. Dear Ruth, we are back in the cottage after spending the morning viewing the ruins of Three Lakes. Saturday was a hot, close day, and the night was close and still. Sunday morning it began to rain, but it was a warm, warm rain with thunder. It began to blow hard while we were at supper and all ate in the living room talking. The wind began to blow harder, and about 4, after it had been quite dark for some time, a peculiar light appeared in the west. For a few moments it was quite light, not more than 2 or 3 minutes, and then Laurel Lake was in a turmoil and you couldn't see across it. It was all over in 4 or 5 minutes. And when Mr. Tuttle came back with the milk and wild tales that he had heard at Annie's about the destruction of Three Lakes, he asked if we were all right, as none of us had taken it very seriously. That was a surprise because I had not realized what a bad wind it was. After breakfast on Monday, Mr. Tuttle said he would take us over to see the damage. So we left at once, a little after 8, and a more surprised crowd you never saw. That beautiful hard maple grove at the right as you go into town is all down. Every tree is uprooted, not broken, but simply lying straight on the ground with all the roots and earth sticking up in the air. As we came to the churches, the Catholic steeple was across the street and the Protestant is a wreck. But actually, this is the Union Congregation Church, which is right next to St. Teresa's, which was also damaged. They lost their steeple, but unfortunately I haven't been able to find any pictures of that happening. Otto Trichek's garage had the big doors broken and some windows too. Charlie's house across the street was twisted at the back and windows broken, and a small frame house was blocking the street. Now this view is looking east on Superior Street, and that's not what I wanted to do. I said, in the back here, you can see a unique step front on this building. That's where the current Shell station is, and that was a garage. These people right here are standing in front of the Hotel Losi, which is now Diversions and Mine Chimes. And where we're sitting right now is probably somewhere in these woods, because at the time, this theater didn't exist yet. She goes on to say, we went around a back street and down to the station, that would be the train station, and trees were down everywhere, and houses were twisted and windows broken. This view is looking north on West School Street. Here you can see the bank that still stands today. This is the Hotel Three Lakes, which later became the Oneida Village and is now an empty lot. And this is Dobbs Store. Dobbs Store was originally a frame building, as you can see, and the tornado just seemed to move it right off the top floor. It was a two-story building. And Fred Dobbs rebuilt with a 2-story brick building that we now know houses the Subway and the Century 21 offices. The high school is all right, but the town hall and movie place is no more. Nothing but the floor. This, whoa. Gotta go back, sorry. I'm carried away here. This is what was called the Opera House. It sat on the empty lot right across the street from the winery, and it went by other names too. It was called the theater and the dance hall, but it was a community gathering place. It was at least another story high, and from what I read, the only thing left standing up on that platform was the piano. Eddie Epler's new addition is down, and the automobiles stored there are flat. Ed Epler is a well-recognized community member from early on. He wrote the book 80 Years in God's Country, and I would recommend that you read through his book. It's a very easy read, but it's all about this early life in Three Lakes. He was also a great mechanic, and he was known to be able to fix and recreate car parts that weren't available unless he made them to fix tourist cars. He also married Olga Johnson, who was part of the Johnson family, which is the Johnson House is part of our museum. The freight house or baggage room of the depot is gone, and the depot waiting room is decidedly on a slant. You can see here, this is the depot building. There's a pot-bellied stove that's only half, but you can see the people that have come into town to help clean up. Here's Ed Epler's garage, and this building across the street is the Badger Hotel that didn't really have a lot of damage. It didn't sustain a lot of damage, but that's because the building right before it, McNinch's, took the brunt of the storm. The Badger Hotel, or Hotel Badger, eventually became, at the remodeling of Cy Williams, the chalet, which was it was a favorite for people through the years. Okay. Here's another view. It looks like they've already started some cleanup because they've got a lot of the debris stacked. But there wasn't much left of the depot. She goes on to say, oops. The lumberyard is one grand mess as well as the building. We had a lumberyard, and I don't know that they ever rebuilt it in that same spot. And then she went on to say that hardly a house west of the tracks that is not damaged or half gone. So here we go. This is still on the east side of the tracks. Here you can see this. Oh gosh, I wish I knew how to do this. No, bring back. Sorry. There we were. Okay. The building that you see right here is Olkowski's Meat Market. And you can see that it was an imposing building. It had 3 stories, although half of it was like a false front. But Olkowski's Meat Market didn't sustain much damage, and it went on to eventually become the American Legion post. They tore down the old part and made the American Legion, and that's why there's an empty lot in between there too. You also see in this picture, you can see right here there's a cow standing. This is Bert Loke's barn. Bert Loke early on had the job of taking tourists or residents or visitors from the train station to the boats that were waiting at various landings to get them to their resorts. Bert moved on from a horse and a wagon to eventually having one of the nicest cars to transport people in that job in Three Lakes. He kept his horses and his wagon and everything in this farm, which you can see is right off of Superior Street. And after the storm, the cow was still standing there chewing its cud. Okay, let me see if I can do this. These are the train tracks. You can see how the cars were lifted off. The big white house at the end of the street, as you turn to go to Rhinelander, is gone. So this view is looking west, standing at, if we were standing right here, right down in this corner is Lickety Splits. Okay, this right here is where we are in the theater, and way down there is where the road turns and goes to Rhinelander. So you can see, although there wasn't much, but the thing that saved a lot of lives, like they said, was the fact that this tornado hit a lot of vacant land. Another thing to note here is down here at the, oh gosh. I'm not good at this part, that's for sure. Down here at the bottom, it says photo by Greenman. If you're familiar with old postcard photos, you'll recognize the name Kingsbury or Parfit. Well, Three Lakes had their own photographer, and his name was E.L. Greenman, and he had a studio right in town that was also destroyed. I'll try this one time. There we go. This is McNinch's store, and she says, McNinch's store is gone except the lean-to in the rear where they lived. This is the corner where the hardware store stands now. Frank and Mary McNinch started their store as soon as there were tourists coming up on trains. Frank had been a lumberjack, and he had come down from Canada, and he picked this location, and he opened a saloon. But unfortunately, the town of Three Lakes went back and forth between for alcohol, not for alcohol, for alcohol, not for alcohol. Frank and Mary couldn't keep up. They changed to having a store, and they did well. People liked them. They were first. They caught the first people off the train, and they provided. At the same time that there were 4 other mercantiles in the 1 block area serving the people too. Frank McNinch had a hard time in Three Lakes though. In 1908, his neighbor, where the hotel stands right next to him, was F.S. Campbell, and F.S. Campbell had built a 2-story brick mercantile, and as soon as he realized too that he was against alcohol, he had some people that possibly, and it's never been proven, blew up his store and turned it into a pile of bricks, and in the process, the McNinch's store took a big hit. So Frank McNinch had to pull it all together again and start all over. Then, 1924, the tornado hits. So Frank and Mary McNinch are a great example of people with the tenacity to confront adversity and move on. This is just a photo of the Badger Hotel, this is where McNinch's is. Here's the Opera House, the dance hall, and this is what later became, after it was remodeled, the Chalet. Another photo by Greenman. Mrs. Berry goes on to say, Mr. Hanson's house is all right, but his trees and shop are demolished. Andrew Hanson ran a world-known boot shop where he made boots for lumberjacks. And he employed 15 people, but his boot shop was destroyed. He lived in the house next door, which is here we go again. There he is. He lived in the house next door right here, which today you'll recognize as the Kelly Law Office. That building still stands. This building eventually became the drugstore. Now, here we go. She goes on to say, Dot's store is the funniest looking thing of all. The second story slipped half off toward the street and then settled down on the store beneath and smashed it flat. The little boy who died was hit on the head by a brick and his skull fractured. The only fatality in this storm was a 13-year-old boy who had been playing with his friends, and they got caught in the storm. They attempted to take shelter in the Three Lakes Hotel right here across the street, but the doors had been blocked against the storm, so the boys ran into the little entrance alcove, and the building collapsed around them. One of the kids was Ed Stepp, and he was knocked unconscious. He woke up in the middle of the street, bloody but okay. The other boy broke his leg, and the other boy sustained a skull fracture and died the following day. But that was the only fatality from this terrible event. Okay, she goes on to say that the roof is off the fruit store and there'll be no more heads bobbed until they get a new barber. Leo Bishop says his 40 acres across town line is flat, only good for firewood. McDonald says his trees are down and only the roofs of 2 cottages damaged, but he would rather have lost the cottages than the trees. Nearly every old tree in Three Lakes is down. It's a miracle that no more were killed. Now we have a look down Superior Street. A few days after, you can see that we still have dirt streets. They had boardwalks, wooden boardwalks. Some things that you might note, a gas pump. There's another gas pump down here. That's what we had for gas pumps back then. And here back here is that same building that we see, the garage with that stepped block front. Mrs. Berry goes on, I heard over in town that the news had been sent out by radio from Eagle River that Three Lakes was destroyed, so I started to write you. I got paper and envelope at news. The counter was thick with sand and glass, but I tried to write you while Mrs. Wood wrote Margaret. Then we started for the post office, which was intact except for the windows. The Western Union and the photographers adjoining flat, and the railroad lines are all out of commission. I ran to the post office and talked to Father, who was talking to a man from Eagle River, and asked if he would take a message. I was afraid that the news would reach you and you might be alarmed. You might send this to your daughter, too, Ruth, as it might interest her. Love, Mother. Three Lakes being a very resilient community that comes back from adversity. This was in the paper soon after. It says, work in clearing up the wreckage at Three Lakes started early Monday morning, and within the week we will have cleaned up to a great extent. The people at Three Lakes who suffered are meeting their losses with a smile and will begin rebuilding at once. This view is 1931, which is maybe 7 years, depending on if this is spring or fall. But you can see now that the streets are paved. There's concrete, sidewalks, curbs. It appears there's gutters, maybe. The trees that did survive have come back, and Three Lakes is back in business. At this time now, I'm going to ask Rhea to come up. Rhea has been instrumental in taking our immersion excursion one step farther, and she's created a walking tour where you can walk up and down the street from the beginning to the end, or whatever parts you want. And we truly appreciate her efforts in doing this. She'll explain this walk to you. Step over.
My name is Leah Rayberg. I am a graphic designer and web designer here in town, and I've been really honored to work alongside the Historical Society and also the group at Union Congregational Church to put all these different puzzle pieces together to mark this milestone for our community. My contribution to it, part of it, was to develop a self-guided walking tour. This is something that you can do anytime. You can do it after today. You can do it whenever is convenient for you. It will start at you start at the west side of town and you follow the path of the store through Superior Street, and stopping along the way to look at photos, and like we did here, and stand where that photo was taken and compare it to what is there today. And then I have stories of the survivors in here as well, and so you can kind of immerse yourself in what they experienced and read as you walk along the way. It takes about a mile. It's about a mile from one end of town to the other. And then it ends at the Three Lakes Cemetery at the grave site of Vincent Zabrowski, who was the sole fatality that day. And then you gotta walk back, so. You're on your own for that one. So I encourage everybody to take the time to do that. And there's 2 ways you can follow along with this tour. You can purchase the printed guidebook that's available from the Historical Society for a $10 donation, or the same information is on a website that you can just open up on your phone and follow along. And also we ask for a $10 online donation to the Historical Society if you do that. And that website is threelakescyclone.com. And probably keep it up for at least a year or so, give people a chance to do that. And then, let me see. I just wanted to also say, and I think Kyle will cover it again, but another touching thing that will happen today is at 4th. So the storm came through 4:30, but at 4:30 today, the churches, some of the churches in town are going to be ringing their bells for 4 minutes, which was the duration of the storm. And so if you're in town at that time and you hear it, or if you are farther away at that point and you don't hear it, I just ask that you take a few minutes during that time and just kind of express some gratitude for the people that came before us and the resiliency that they had and the legacy that they left our community. Or perhaps you could take time to just say a prayer of thanksgiving to God for just keeping his hand over our town this whole time. And then with that, it's Geoff up next. Yep. Geoff Weller, let's give a round of applause.
So one more time for Kyle and Rita, thanks very much. For the record, we are for alcohol, correct? So they asked me to come here today to talk about, of course, the 100-year anniversary of the very large, devastating storm that came through here 100 years ago today at 4 o'clock this afternoon, and talk a bit about how the technology has changed since then, and about how radar has moved and how the town has progressed. So I'm going to walk you through a presentation here that I hope you enjoy. So first off, okay, first off, that was an EF4 tornado. So that's exactly the kind of force that the residents of this town went through 100 years ago today. That happened back, I took that video back in Oklahoma, where I went to college, the storm chase there. That storm ended up killing 34 people. But you can just feel the devastation, right? The force those things have. Of course, as a trained storm spotter, I know where I can put myself in relation to that storm where I'm still safe. But you can kind of feel the force of those things, right? And that kind of force came right through here, 100 years ago today. And of course, that was devastating for a lot of people. All right, and then this video here, this just kind of show you an idea of how powerful these storms are. This was, and it will be here in a second, the largest tornado ever recorded on Earth, right? Ended up being 2.5 miles wide. 2.5 miles wide. So this turned into an EF5, winds near 318 miles per hour. So it's stronger than the one that came through here, but at that point it makes no difference at all, right? Winds at 200 miles per hour versus 318, it's still a devastating scenario. This storm goes in El Reno, Oklahoma, right? So lots of plains, and end up doing devastation there. But you get the idea of how these things form, and I'm going to walk you through the atmospheric gymnastics dynamics that go through that as well when we talk about how these things are formed here in just a moment. But you get the idea. This is a multiple vortex tornado, meaning there's several funnels inside what's called a mesocyclone. You see how the whole cloud is kind of turning? This is sped up. I'm not driving this fast. But you see how the whole mesocyclone is turning? You can actually get 4, 5, 6 tornadoes out of a large storm like that. And this one did that. And again, it was 2.5 miles wide at its largest point, which of course would devastate pretty much any town, right, with a storm that wide. These are rare. The last EF5 has been several years. And I'm going to walk you through here a little bit how we measure that. It's measured by the extent of the damage the storm does, right? So you can still have winds that are, less or more than this, but if it doesn't do any damage, they're hard to kind of rate sometimes. So, but this is El Reno, Oklahoma, a EF5, and this was several years ago, and you can see how those things form very easily there. What year? That was in 2014. 2014. All right, so here is a look at what an EF4 tornado can do. So, in the pictures we saw, we didn't see devastation like that in Three Lakes, but this storm did devastation like this. Remember, it was 64 miles wide, or 64 miles long, right? This thing started, back in Clark County and ended in Forest County, right? So, storms this size, of that magnitude, they like to do that. A lot of tornadoes are very short-lived. They, 100 miles wide, they linger for, a mile or two. This one, not so much. This one was 64 miles long or so, ended up being about, 200 yards wide, which is still a very large storm, right? But that gives you an idea of what can happen. And like the pictures that we saw, from Kyle, tornadoes can be finicky, right? They can, the cow lived. How'd that cow live, right? But yet next to it was complete devastation, right? And there's all sorts of pictures and stories about how kitchen cabinets are, with glass shutters are intact, but yet the end room is destroyed. It's interesting how the winds and the patterns can do that. But how the damage is assessed is how we rate tornadoes, right? So in this case, we have clearly a house taken off its foundation, right? That is indicative of an EF4 or an EF5 tornado, and I'll have more on that here in just a moment. Here is that rating system, right? It's called the Enhanced Fujita Scale. This has gone through a lot of, meteorological testing the last decade or so in our weather communities. But this is generally what the wind field is for how storms are measured. And again, it's measured by the damage that it does, not so much its highest wind speed, right? That gives us a clearer image of how devastating storms are. Tornadoes in meteorology are not given names, like hurricanes are given names, right? If it's a very large hurricane or a devastating hurricane, those names are retired, right? That's not happening for tornadoes. There's just simply too many of them. Ask Kyle to hand out some paperwork for you guys if you want to go through that. I dug up basically the 80-year history of Oneida County tornadoes, and it gives you a list of what those are and where they went through and what damage they did. So I think I made like 50 copies, so we can kind of pass those around if you'd like to, Kyle, for me. Any questions on the Enhanced Fujita Scale on how damage is assessed via what the damage is, and then by trained weather personnel from the National Weather Service, they come out here and they measure, what it did, and then give it a rating, right? All right, there are different types of tornadoes. So this is a rope tornado. They typically do the least amount of damage, but if you get under this thing, you know it, right? It'll take out your shed, it'll take out your house. You can see the base of that thing is probably about 25 to 50 yards wide. This is a picture taken from a farm, of course, but it's a rope tornado. this is generally at a stage where they're dying out, right? What's happening is cold air is mixing down with the warmer air, the cold air is winning, and the storm gets suffocated. So in this situation, this storm is generally dying. So if you see a rogue tornado, that is a really good sign that the storm is weakening and not getting stronger. This is a cone tornado. If you see this one, you're in trouble. This is in a developing stage, right? This is typically where, as a meteorologist, we can see on radar, we can see that it's either going to go crazy on us or it's going to start weakening pretty quickly, right? This one's strong. This was taken out of Oklahoma as well. You can see on the right-hand side of the frame here, it's called a rear flange downdraft. It is where more moist air is being sucked in. On the back side of it, you can see a little bit higher up. That is where cold air is mixing down, and as you get those processes to rotate, right, that keeps or sustains the momentum and the circulation going. So this is a cone. This is what's called a stovepipe tornado. All right, these are generally pretty rare, but they like to make multiple vortices out of these. Like the video we saw where they had the big mesocyclone, these tend to like to produce what's called a stovepipe tornado, and that's basically the circumference at the top is as big as at the bottom, right? They kind of go like a pipe and straight down. And then, of course, the one that moved through this area and did across Wisconsin 100 years ago is called a wedge tornado, right? The wedge. These are the most destructive. They're the largest. The one that hit El Reno back in 2014 was a wedge tornado as well. And again, these things can be as big as they want to be. They can do whatever they want to do. I would say, in general relation to atmospherics in North America, that most tornadoes like to move from southwest to northeast, right? It's just a general flow of the atmosphere across the states, right? So there is a lot that can be said about the theories or the experiences of people who, say, hey, it was quiet, right? All of a sudden it was quiet, and then all of a sudden, bam, it got me, right? And that's very true with tornadoes, because what typically tends to happen is you enter a lull in front of the storm, and on the back side of them, the tornado is there, and it sweeps through very quickly. So there is a lot of credibility to people who say there was nothing, the wind was calm, and then all of a sudden, poof, it wasn't, right? There's a lot of credibility in that, because that is, in meteorology, pretty common. All right, let's talk about technology these days. Of course, 100 years ago, there wasn't radar. Radar was developed in 1945, generally, when the United States government decided to give the National Weather Service 25 old radars. That the Weather Service said, okay, we can help develop these into something more and start helping the public out in getting ahead of these storms. The technology's come a long way, of course, since then. As you now know with your personal cell phones, with the scrolling on the screens. This is called a radar. The back of the screen is a radar, right? Now, there are two different types of radar these days. There's convective radar, and there's something called a Doppler radar. Doppler radar, which is what this one is something that measures wind. It measures wind. You're probably thinking, well, how do you measure the wind? There's nothing to it, right? Well, it turns out in this air, in this room, there's pollen. There's birds, there's butterflies, not in here right now, but these Doppler radars can see that stuff. So they can see the storm, they can see the wind motion inside a storm from the things in it, whether it's dust, allergens, raindrops, that kind of stuff. The radar is that sensitive these days where it can also pick up on those things. All right, here's an example of the two radars side by side. All right, so on the right-hand side is conventional radar. This is what many of us grew up with. It's all we knew forever, right? You get a radar picture, it gives it a color. Red is bad, white is bad. Like light green, light blues, they're okay, right? We'll be just fine. On the right-hand side, that's the conventional radar. On the left-hand side, that's the Doppler radar. Now, what's really, really cool about Doppler radar and the technology that it brings, again, it sees the wind, right? So whenever it sees the wind, and it gives the wind a color, based upon what direction that wind is going. So if it's coming toward the radar, it gives it a color of green. If it's going away, it gives the color of red. Well, what if you get red and green together? What does that mean? That's a circulation, right? Something's rotating in it. Well, that is how a tornado forms, right? They will always form in the cloud first, right? And of course, radars can see in the clouds, which is why the lead time these days is up to 23 minutes for warnings. That's huge, right? Back in the 40s, they didn't have that. 1924, they didn't have that, right? We have at least about 20 minutes these days because the Weather Service and its private meteorologists, we've gotten really good at seeing rotations in the clouds and then putting warnings on them, right? Now, we gotta be a little bit careful with that because you can cry wolf, right? You know when a warning is issued, especially a tornado warning or a thunderstorm warning, your phones go crazy, right? The hard part about that is your phones are going crazy in a specific geographic area, like a whole county. That's huge, right? Well, there could be a tornado in Three Lakes, but not one in Minocqua or not one in Rhineland or something like that, right? So you have to be, there's a bit of cry wolf that goes on here that we're really concerned about in meteorology land because, you know, you may be getting hit hard with a tornado, but your neighbor over here is seeing nothing. That's a problem. The technology is not quite there yet. The geolocating piece of that is not quite put together quite perfectly yet. That comes together for us nicely. But you get the idea. We can put a warning on a storm about 25 minutes ahead of time these days. You'll see me on TV. You'll see her crawl across the bottom of television. Your phone's going crazy. The goal is get the word out, right? Get the word out and be smart. You're all smart. Take precautions and get things safer life. All right, that's the two side by side, and then this is, okay. So this is conventional radar, and it did the job, right? See the swirl right there? That is actually the radar seeing the tornado. And you see the dark purple burst out of that? It's called a debris ball. That's how we know in meteorology that storm is picking up things, houses, trees, dogs, cats, whatever it is, right? That little burst of purple there is where it gets so dense, the atmosphere is so dense that the radar knows that's something more than just rain in the atmosphere, right? And that's how we see real big trouble on the radar. If this was happening across anywhere in our viewing area, you know, Devin, myself, Conrad, Chase, and I will be on TV nonstop saying take cover because this is the worst case scenario right here. This is the storm that went through Moore, Oklahoma. You may remember that back in 1999. And it was a thing because it kind of was on the cusp of the technology being really perfected. And it was the first kind of storm that the weather community, weather chasers all came together and said, we're gonna really measure this thing. And they did, right? They got a lot of data out of it. So the technology there has increased tremendously. There's also weather balloons. So your tax dollars every day send 2 balloons up in space. Fun, right? Well, what they're doing though is they're doing a couple things. They're taking measurements of the atmosphere that is helping us as meteorologists predict the weather. So we take that data, which gets sent back to us, that looks like this. Oh, hang on. This is what's called a jet stream. You've heard of it, right? So obviously a river of air, it can move very, very quickly, and it moves around the world. Now you maybe have a question of, well, what is a jet stream? How does it form? It is essentially warm air and cold air colliding. Cold air is dense, warm air is not dense. When you two collide together, they begin to move, right? Throw in there the rotation of the Earth is something called Coriolis effect, and these things kind of make waves across the entire world, right? So in North America, we go through several jet streams a year, right? There's the polar jet stream, there's the subtropical jet stream, and as we go through the seasons, one kind of becomes the primary, right? Because they're just far enough apart where one doesn't really impact the other. If you get under one of those, that's what's controlling the weather. That's what's steering storm systems across the world. So, for example, last winter, if you like snow, it sucked, right? There wasn't any snow. Last winter, the subtropical jet stream stayed south by Florida, and the polar jet stream stayed north across Canada. Well, we were in that not-so-great place in the middle that got no weather, right? And we were stuck there for like months, right? And it wasn't a good place to be for an economy, the North Boys, that depends on snowfall for a lot of things, right? This year, we're heading into an El Nino winter, All right, you've heard of El Nino before, right? So an El Nino is a warming of the Pacific Ocean waters over here, and what that does, it really messes with weather patterns across the world, right? So in El Nino winters, what typically happens in North America is about a 64-65% chance of it occurring, which is pretty good, right, in meteorology circles, that we are going to stay pretty dry and kind of warm through November. But then the polar jet stream takes over, right? Brings down some really, brings down some really cold air across the Great Lakes, and we get wetter than average. So this could mean an above average snowfall for us in December, January, February, March, April, May, June. Right? It could mean that. I mean, the signs are there. The signs are there this year. Last year they weren't there at all. So if you like snow, it'll likely be a later in the season snow, and it could be a pretty good one. And remember, we went for several years there where we're breaking snowfall records every single year, right? So this could be a good sign for us going forward. All right.
It's not vodka.
There you go. All right, let's talk tornado developments, right? There's just a couple different ingredients. So you've all seen thunderstorms, right? And you all feel like most of the wind that comes out either out of the storm or into the storm ahead of it, right? Well, if you get that gust of wind it's always rotating horizontally, right? Storms need that. So storms go up, right? They build in the atmosphere, they take air with it. So you're always going to have a column of air rising into a thunderstorm, right? And on the leading edge of that really intense rising motion, you get vortices like this. Now the trick is, if you like tornadoes, is to get that vortice to turn this way, right? And that is where the science isn't perfect yet. It's still kind of a bit of a mystery of what storms will produce them and which storms won't. Certainly, like we know when the ingredients are there that we can really forecast when there could be a tornado day. And thus, as the general public, you will see that as a tornado watch, right? Which means, hey, the ingredients are here, and it could get a little messy later on. So keep an eye on the weather today as you go about your day, and be ready to take cover if needed. That's a watch, and of course, a warning is when something has been spotted, or it's been radar indicated. Again, a little bit of a fear that crying wolf thing. It's been radar indicated to say, hey, this is forming as we speak. And they do something like this, right? So the updrafts go into the storm, you get the updraft to rotate, and if you get the right angle where you get the vortice to spin down to the ground, it's hard to stop that. It's like a faucet drain or a bathtub drain, right? There's lots of stuff, air in the atmosphere that once that gets rotating, it's hard to wind that down without a big something changing. And usually the big something is the storm pulls down really cold air from up above, right? That kind of just wipes out the rotation. You gotta have the warm and the cold mixing to have the rotation going. And you know, you guys have flown in airplanes, right? Next time you're flying in an airplane, put the back of your hand against the window, you know, feel how cold that is. It's normally, you know, I would say right now about 10,000 feet up, probably 10 degrees below zero right now. You know, it's always very cold in there. So that is generally how these storms form. You can see and understand now how, as radar, we see that. And those balloons I was talking to you about, they give us, as meteorologists, something like this, right? And I put this in here, and I have the next one too. The next one is actually today. This is today, I think. But generally these lines, as you go up in the atmosphere, it's measuring the ingredients you need for weather, right? So if you get the dew point close to the temperature, what do you get? You get fog, right? If you get a wind field close to a temperature inversion, what do you get? You get descending air and not good weather. So it's just, as meteorologists, we're trained to know these things, but this is what your tax dollar is paying for. It's paying for graphs like this that I get to study every day and look and see what's going on. Now I will say that computer technology these days, it helps me with this stuff, right? I'm not studying graphs like this much anymore. But as you go up in the atmosphere, it's always changing. The wind is usually always getting stronger as you go up because there's no friction down here at the surface like there is. Also, satellite technology, right? If you watch me on TV, you know I like to put those up there, right? And technology here is getting really good. You can thank Elon Musk for that too. infrared satellite picture. So what this is doing, infrared is measuring heat, right? It's basically asking the radar, how cold is the cloud top? Why do we care? Why do we care? Well, the worst weather is typically under the coldest cloud tops, right? So on this map, under the white, under the yellow, under the blue is where you have the worst weather. The cold part of the year, the tropics are kind of thunderstormy, Texas has some severe weather, that's where the worst weather is. The clear sun across the plains to the west, that's just a nice day with a little bit of smoke in the atmosphere there. So that is how the technology there has gotten good. Now I will say too that you know how your iPhone cameras got really good? So has the satellite cameras, where in our weather cave we can literally dial down to people jumping on their trampoline in the backyard. Right? We don't do it, but it's one of those things where if there was a tornado going through that neighborhood, that would come in handy, right? We would want to know exactly where that tornado is. So if your kids like trampolines, we're looking for them. All right. This part of the country is serviced by the Green Bay National Weather Service, right? So our big office is in Green Bay. Of course, National Weather Service. Thank you. The National Weather Service is located there, and we are in constant communication with them daily, basically, on what's happening. In fact, Rhinelander at our TV station is the official reporting station for precipitation in Rhinelander, right? So every day we're calling in how much it rained or how much it snowed and how much snow on the ground. But there are lots of weather service offices. In our DMA, or in our viewing area, we deal with up to 5 offices: Marquette, Green Bay, Minneapolis, across, and Duluth, right? A pretty big area there, right? So it goes from Lake Superior down to Adams County, which is a large geographic area. And sometimes it can be troublesome because, of course, the weather in the UP is often very different than the weather happening across parts of central Wisconsin. So that's our challenge in the fun part of our day. And then, of course, here's the studio where, when you see me every day on TV, we're presenting that forecast in a place like this in front of a green screen just like that. So, we're not, when you see us at home, we're literally seeing what you're seeing. So if I start laughing, I'm laughing at myself. Right? It's just kind of right there. That's how we present the work. All right. All right, so this is an archive now of where all of the tornadoes have been. All right? And you can see a trend, right? It's a trend generally east of the Mississippi River. Although I threw this in here today because I would argue, and you can win some arguments these days, that Tornado Alley is changing. What we all grew up in knowing in our history books of where that is, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, Texas, that has shifted. It shifted as a result of something. Is that climate change? Is it, what is that? I don't know, but at the end of the day, it's shifted. And it does now include parts of Wisconsin that we found. It looks more like this. So this is more of a Tornado Alley the last decade, right? And there's other ones too. There's a Hoosier Alley, Dixie Alley. The two that have been, of course, in the news a lot is the Dixie Alley one, and of course the Tornado Alley. Now Dixie Alley, because those tornadoes, they form across East Texas, and they generally hit places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama overnight, which is, of course, the worst time for a storm to come through because that can be really dangerous to have strong tornadoes come through your area at night. But I would argue that our alley is changing based upon what we've been used to across the years, right? And then here is the frequency trend. And you can see, again, this gives another good reason to understand that it has shifted a bit to the east, right? That does now include parts of Wisconsin, who generally sees, the average is about 20 a year, EF0, EF1s. We've been averaging closer to 40 to 50 a year the last several years around here. And of course, most of those have been across like the Madison area up over toward Eau Claire. So, this is my lake house that I'm in today. So the difference here is, winds of 30 miles per hour, of course, are way different than winds of 100 and 200 and 300 miles per hour, right? And that is why the weather forecasting, the meteorology, all of that is important. And I put this slide in here today because this time of year, there's something called evapotranspiration. Have you ever heard of it? Evapotranspiration. And that is basically the corn is sweating. The corn is sweating, right? The soybeans, the corn, all that is sweating. And what that can do is it can add humidity to the atmosphere. That heat does what? It rises. And in really perfect conditions, you can form small EF0, EF1 tornadoes out of heat that is generated out of cornfields. Kind of cool, right? Up here, not really a factor. Portage County, though, Adams County, parts of Erie, Madison, are a factor because this is, of course, heavy corn country across that area. All right, so I put this in as an idea of what and how big a thunderstorm is. This is 51,000 feet from base to top, right? When you see a thunderstorm that has what we call an anvil top to it, think of a top hat, right? Where it kind of hits the top and then it spreads out. That is that storm hitting something called the tropopause. The tropopause is a layer in the atmosphere where temperatures start getting warmer again, right? Warmer again. Because you know, just think of it as you're making macaroni and cheese. The heat likes to rise up, right? And if it can't rise up anymore, it stops. It kind of spreads out. So when you see an anvil top and you they're really cool and fun to look at, but they're generally 40, 50,000 feet in the atmosphere, and underneath them is a very, very, very strong storm, right? It's indicative, or it's telling me as a meteorologist that there are very strong updrafts in that storm, and that storm could likely or possibly produce a tornado based upon those updrafts turning the right direction. Okay. And Theo, of course, likes bright sunny days. He has asked me for more of those. Any questions from the audience? Yes?
How come Nevada has 0 tornadoes?
Because Nevada is landlocked, meaning the atmosphere there is dry, right? You need to have moisture or something buoyant in the atmosphere to rise up through it to get something to rotate. So Nevada, no tornadoes for you. Yes?
It's been said that if you see a big storm coming and also the sky turns green,
Yep.
it's dangerous. What makes it turn green?
Great question. His question was, when you hear a big storm is coming and the sky turns green, when you have a green sky, that is indicative of one thing. Large hail is coming out of that sky. Okay? Light goes through hail in a different spectrum than rain, right? That color turns to green as viewed from the ground, right? So that means that storm has very large updrafts and making it big hail, right? Which means it could be a very powerful storm, right? Very strong storm. Okay. Yes?
Do we know if 1924 was an El Nino or a La Nina or some climatological year?
2024 was a La Nina right now. So La Nina is an opposite of El Nino. La Nina is a warming of the Pacific Ocean waters, right? El Nino is the opposite of that. So
But
right now we're what's called ENSO neutral. Like there's nothing either way. It's balanced right now. It's forecasted to go El Nino in a very strong one. Right?
But 1924, when this
1924, sorry. I do not know.
Okay.
Yes?
Yeah, I heard you were on it. How much information went out to pilots need to know when you're flying?
A lot. I would say, half the time I take getting in the air, I'm weather briefing, right? Because there's a point A to point B, and you have to get there safely. And I'll tell you a quick story. I was in flight school in Phoenix, Arizona, and when you get your private pilot's license, you get that, and then you get your instrument rating, right? Had gotten that. Then you get your commercial rating. I was working toward that. You have to have 250 flight hours to be a commercial pilot, right? So what you do is you grab a buddy and you fly around the country to gain hours, right? So we were working for a flight school, and we were briefed on the weather. It's a company, so I'm flying for them. Their job is to brief me at that point, right? And we had a clear sailing. We're going to fly over Palm Springs and land in Long Beach, fly over to Long Beach, and then over to Vegas and back to Phoenix, all in a day. Right? That was our sort of little day. So we get up, we're bebopping along, and over Palm Springs, what happens? We hit icing. Icing. Well, I'm in a Piper Seminole. It's not rated for ice, right? So what does ice do? It accumulates on everything. Picture the worst freezing rain event ever. So all of a sudden the windshield is frozen over, which is not a big deal because I'm an instrument-rated pilot. I know what to do. I can still do that. But what it does is it messes with the aerodynamics of the plane, right? All of a sudden we're heavy, right? We're really heavy, and we can't maintain level flight. We're sinking. So I get on the horn with ATC, you know, it's like, hey, LA Center, you know, permission to descend, you know, to 9,500 feet. And they're like, negative, you know? We're gonna go there anyway, so here we go. Negative, there's a 10,000-foot mountain right ahead of you. Oh, that's freezing like negative, okay. So at that moment, there's something on a plane called a pitot tube. It had frozen over, right? When that freezes over, your instruments that I was using as an instrument pilot, they tumble. You don't know what you're doing. You're in the cloud, you're tumbling, right? The plane is taking on ice, I'm sinking slowly, right? I look over at the guy next to me, Rich. He's crying. So I gave Rich one job. Like, Rich, your job is to pull back on the yoke, you know, and so if we break out of this, we're gonna go up, not down, right? That's your job. So then I declared an emergency. When you declare an emergency, LA Center, you get like one person directing you. And she directed me, I lost all controls. The ailerons had frozen to the side of the wings, but I still had engine power. I was in a dual engine aircraft, right? So she was able to maneuver me into this canyon around Palm Springs, on the north side of Palm Springs. That all of a sudden I broke out and was like, oh, you know, and like the ice breaks off, it's like 50 degrees, and like, okay. So we end up landing like in Irvine, I think it was. And Rich hopped on the Southwest flight back to he quit the program the next day. But I'll tell you, the story there is I learned a lot about what I was capable of in that moment, right? Because if I would have been Rich that day, we would have made it, right? I needed to be calm in that moment. But that tells a story about how the weather pilot briefing, although important, it can be wrong sometimes. And you have to react to that as a pilot in command. But a lot of what you do as a pilot is a weather briefing, and of course, that helps you get your point B. All right, any more questions? Yes?
I have a question about what they call straight lines.
Yep.
You get them in three legs. Is that from the tornado, or is it a
All right, so straight line winds are not a tornado. Right? A lot of people, when they have damage in their yard, want to say, yeah, I had my tornado yesterday, even though it was straight line winds, right? And what those are generally, there's two types of them. There's things called derechos, and there's just straight line winds. So straight line winds generally form from collapsing thunderstorms, right? So all that air that was going up, all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're gonna go down, right? And as it hits the Earth's surface, it spreads out, and you get that straight line wind damage, right? That was 5 years ago when Elko got hit hard, Forest County up here got hit hard. This whole area was just devastated from straight line winds. And we know it's straight line winds because all the damage has everything in a very linear path, right? There's no circularity to it. So it's a collapsing thunderstorm. Now derechos are a bit different. Derechos are huge complexes of storms that still have rising motion in them, but like they're just so strong they push air out ahead of them. Right? The pressure changes are so drastic, where you can get 60, 70-mile-per-hour winds out ahead of the storm, and then it can literally travel for 100, 200, 300 miles, right? They're very, very destructive derechos. So we had a derecho 5 years ago, last month. Yeah?
Just to follow up on that, the 1924 storm in the photos was called a cyclone. What's the difference between a cyclone and a tornado?
There isn't a difference. There isn't a difference. Yeah, at all. Yep.
So in this 1924 storm, were there other storms that outbroke that were operating in the state, or
Yep.
was it just like one?
No, it wasn't just us. It was Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois. All had a huge complex of storms. The worst complex, though, was across Wisconsin. And I believe there was something, I think it was 37 tornadoes spawned from the whole storm complex. The worst of which, the highest rated one, was the one that went through Clark County, through Oneida County, through, up to Forest County. But no, it's rare to have it be a unique storm all by itself. I will say though, next time you're watching us on the weather, take a look at out ahead of the storm. That little, you'll see a big line of storms, of course, on the radar. Watch the area out ahead of it though. That is where the wind is coming out of the south at the surface, but out of the west above us. That is where you get a circular motion, and that's where you get what's called a supercell, and they can be very discrete. You can have just a couple of them, but they're really strong if you get underneath them. Yeah. Okay, well, I thank you guys very much.
So my name is Kurt Drum. I'm the technical director here at the theater. If that's wires attached to it, I get to play with it and fix it and break it. So we have a fun time here. I wanted to thank Geoff and Kyle for their presentations today. My great ancestors were here in 1924 and lived through that tornado. Just a quick thing on aviation. I'm a commercial pilot, just like Geoff. I work for Nicolay College, and we just got a 2-year grant to start an aviation education program. We're going to be teaching ground schools, drones, provide flight simulator. It's a 2-year program. We're partnering with Fox Valley Tech to get college degrees that people want. We're offering another private pilot ground school next spring, March, April, May. If anybody is interested, or you know anybody that's interested in learning to fly or learning an aviation career, the whole grant is all aimed at aviation career development. So we'll be working with high schools and stuff. You can go to our website, go to nicolaycollege.edu/aviation, and we'll be having all the updates there, including the information on the ground school. And it's cool because we do 10 sessions. There's a big session on aviation weather. We're fortunate that Geoff invites us to the TV station for a couple hours and talks about it. So if you know anybody interested in aviation, go to the website, call the college, track me down. We'll be glad to do that. I think Geoff and Kyle will still both be here for a few minutes. We do have a concert tonight. They're going to be moving in as soon as I tear out the stage. So if you want to come back for a show tonight, it's 2 guys, keyboards, violin, and harmonica. So it should be a pretty good show. So thank you very much.